If we could come to order, please. Good evening, councillors, officers, members of the public, those that may be joining us via the webcast this evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation Committee meeting here at Maidstone. Today, Tuesday, the 5th of December 2017. The usual housekeeping, if I may. We don't anticipate any fire practice this evening, so should we hear the alarm, then please assume it is real. Miss Tunnicliffe, who is seated to my right, will ascertain the appropriate evacuation method, and we will follow her instructions in that eventuality. I'd like to also remind you that tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council. But if anyone else is intending to record these proceedings, I would appreciate it if you would let me know now. And I ask this not to prevent you, just so that others in the chamber will be aware. I don't see that anybody indicates. We'll move straight on with apologies for absence. Councillor English.
First of all, Councillor Wilby, and I will have to apologise because I'm likely to have to leave before the end.
Thank you, Councillor. I've also been advised that Councillor de Wiggendon will be joining us shortly, subject to his arrival at Maidstone East, or West, I'm not sure which, any moment now. But nonetheless, we will proceed. There are no notifications of substitute members, and there are no urgent items, and there are no visiting members this evening. So that's already got us to agenda item 5, and I would like to take disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures, please? No disclosures. Disclosures of lobbying. Councillor English.
I've been lobbied on aspects of the air quality review.
Okay. I think a number of us were engaged in public consultation. That's probably not the same as lobbying, but we'll note that nonetheless. Are there any other disclosures of lobbying, please? No further disclosures noted. Item 7, if we can consider whether any item should be taken in private because of the disclosure of exempt information. We have no yellow papers this evening, so I propose everything will be in public session. Next, we can turn to the minutes of our last meeting, which was held 7th of November and then further adjourned to the 13th. You'll find the minutes commencing at page 1 through 17, published with the agendas. I trust you've all had time to scan those through. Are there any inaccuracies that need to be noted? That being the case that there are none, I will duly sign those as an accurate copy. Is that agreed, members? Thank you. Item 9, presentation of petitions. There are no petitions this evening. However, at item 10, this is questions from members of the public. I've been advised that we have 2 questioners this evening, and I'd like to start by inviting Mrs. Cleater to come to the microphone with her question, please.
This question is regarding the proposed housing at the Springfield site. With over 500 units being built on Springfield site and the Royal Engineers Road, what plans have been put in place to ensure we don't end up with the traffic situation such as we have on Hermitage Lane, which is basically chaos?
Thank you, Mrs. Cleater. The response I have for you is drawn largely from the detail in our local plan. Included within policy H111, which is the Springfield allocation, there are criteria which address highways and transport matters. Access to the site will be taken from the A229 Springfield and A229 Royal Engineers roundabouts only. Improvements to and provision of pedestrian and cycle links is required to facilitate connections with the town centre. Finally, improvements are required to the eastern bank of the river towpath for pedestrian and cycle use. As part of the planning process, a transport assessment will be required to explain how impacts of the development will be mitigated, and this will be assessed by MBC as the local planning authority and KCC as the highways authority. Do you have a supplementary question that arises from the answer?
From the answer you've given me then, there are no further improvements to the roundabout at the barracks, because it's actually quite chaotic now, never mind with 500 extra houses there.
Any further improvements will be drawn out of the transport assessment. So, and there is a total package of highways improvements which goes across the whole borough, and there may be further improvements that feature through that as well.
Thank you. I just hope it's an improvement on the assessment that was done on Hermitage Lane.
Thank you for your question. We have a second question from Mrs. Darling. If you would like to come to the microphone, please.
Good evening. I noted on the local plan, it states that on this development, the target rates for affordable housing provision within the Maidstone area will be 30%, with the exception of policy H1 in brackets 11, Springfield Royal Engineers Road, which is set at 20%, where there will only be a provision for 20% affordable housing. And what is the reason for this, please?
When the local plan was submitted, it was supported by a viability study, DEL 002 revised plan and SIL viability study, which determined that 30% affordable housing at H111 Springfield is not feasible due to site constraints. As a result, a 30% affordable housing requirement would have resulted in limited capacity to provide for necessary supporting infrastructure. The lower requirement of 20% would allow for an appropriate balance of affordable housing with the need to provide infrastructure.
Right. I have actually read what you have just read to me, and I simply don't understand what it means. I mean, what does the viable bit mean, and why is it that 20% of affordable housing is more manageable, and what are the site constraints? To me, it just doesn't make any sense, or I have no idea what it means, really.
In very simple terms, the viability study looks at the cost of the site, the cost of construction, the cost of providing the affordable housing and the other associated infrastructure, and then comes to a conclusion of whether it is commercially viable to actually deliver the site or not. Because quite clearly, if there wasn't enough margin in the project, then the site would lay dormant and no developer would actually bring it forwards. And I think that's a major issue across the whole of the country, where developers are sitting on sites and not developing, and we did not wish that to be the case for this site, based upon a very thin viability assessment.
Am I allowed to say anything else?
Unfortunately, under our procedure rules, you're not,
Yeah,
but
right.
I'm sure that we would be very happy to
I just wanted to
discuss
check.
with you outside of this forum
Yeah.
and consider that in a bit more detail. But
Okay, then.
for now,
Right.
that question session ends.
Okay.
But very happy to talk with you afterwards.
Thank you.
Members, can I ask you to take your eyes to agenda item 11. This is the committee work programme. You'll find it at page 18. The work programme is set out as per the papers. I think when we were looking at agenda setting a short while back with myself and the Vice Chair, we were considering the regular report that comes to us concerning KPIs and the regular annual committee cycle where we re-evaluate the KPIs and whether they should change, whether we should be looking at different items. It was my initial feeling, and I think the Vice Chair shared this view, that possibly given the work programme that we have ahead of us, we may not wish to spend time revisiting the issue of which KPIs do we monitor, do we change them. And I would like to take a sounding from you whether you support that or not. Does anybody have a view? Councillor English? Specifically on this matter of whether we want to spend committee agenda time reviewing the KPIs again. I'm not talking about the reporting of them, but whether we want to change them. Okay.
We've done that relatively recently.
Right.
I don't think we need to keep doing it.
No, that was my feeling, but I just wanted to check that with you. Are there other matters on the work programme you'd like to identify?
The issue on 20-mile-an-hour speed limits was on the March agenda previously. It seems to have slipped back to April. Is there any particular reason for that? It's been in for that date for a long...
I think the main reason, and the Vice Chair, I'm sure, will bear me out on this, is looking at the workload coming forwards and the size of the meetings. I think we will probably be minded to have at least one additional meeting in January because we have the tri-study. There's some major decisions and quite a lot of detail around that. So I can promise you there's no intention of not bringing that item forwards, but we are prioritising the work stream on an essential basis at the moment.
I'm a bit unhappy that it slipped again because I was persuaded against my better judgment to leave it until after the planning review rather than pushing it forward at the time, and so that's effectively delayed it 8 months from when it was going to be discussed before. So, you know, I don't want it... If it is, I say April is fine if it actually happens. I'd rather have it March. I certainly don't want it to slip any...
What I can say to you is when we get to the March agenda setting, possibly the April one, we'll keep that foremost in our minds, but certainly as things stand, the next month is looking like at least 2 meetings, so you'll understand why it is difficult to juggle. But yeah, we'll note that and take that on board, Councillor English. Any other observations or comments? Councillor Mrs Springer?
Thank you, Chair. The only comment I've got is further down we've got a gypsy and traveller need and supply with no date. Have we got a vague idea of when that might come to us? Because I have raised concerns before that I do consider we are dramatically oversupplying. Now, I know our need is a minimum, but I do think we do appear to be rocketing ahead on the numbers, and it does concern me. I just wondered if we've got a time when that might be reviewed.
I do know that there's some fairly significant opinion work being undertaken around this at the moment. Mr Regerton, is there anything you can add about the timescales, or Mrs Lee?
I would simply say that it's important that we undertake the next assessment to inform the local plan review, and it's undertaken at the right time. We have this sort of window when we have to produce our evidence so that it doesn't go out of date and it's still considered to be extant and robust. So I think, yes, we'll be engaging with members to understand the scope of the potential review, and I look forward to comments in that regard, but let's tie it into part of that process.
Councillor Willis, were you wanting to speak?
Thames. So Thames. Two things that have happened since Thameslink. I think the council will do everything they can to question that decision. Is it appropriate? Could we find a way of putting that on the agenda so an officer reports back to us as to any work that's been done or anything we can do as a committee to bolster that? Because it's going to take time.
Perhaps if Vice Chair and I could just take that under consideration for the next round of agenda setting. I think the letter from KMEP that we all had a copy of today was very useful, sets out the case very clearly. Perhaps in the first instance we see what response that merits. But yes, we will make a note for agenda setting that... It does.
I may be teaching you suck eggs here, Chair, but it does affect us as a council in terms that we're working on schemes that are costing money, officer time, the economics department are working on doing this, and now this decision has been made by a civil servant without any consultation. Yeah, and combined with our own ambitions for regenerating that end of town with the Maidstone East development, there's a lot at stake. As I said, I think the KMEP letter sets the case out extremely well. That's supported by, 17 districts? It's not just us responding on that matter, it's supported by the business community. I think that's a very significant response that's already been made to the delays. Let's see what that merits and then we'll consider further. The other thing is, obviously, the bus review. I think the deadline for the consultation is the end of January, or is it February, with KCC?
I think you're referring to a KCC review there, not something undertaken by this committee. But yeah, carry on.
But we can put a borough council response into that. I think I'm right in saying, and can that be discussed at this committee before to maximise it?
Members, are you all aware of this KCC consultation? I'd invite you to give us a steer whether you think we should formally make a response, or given the diversity of the area covered by that, whether it's actually appropriate for individual ward members to make the most knowledgeable response to the impact in their patch. So simply put, do you want something to come to us if the timescale for reply allows, or do we leave it for individuals? Councillor English.
I think our constituents might wonder why, on something that affects quite a lot of people, the council had not made a formal response. I think individual councillors and parish councils should make responses themselves, but the borough has a responsibility to make one itself.
Does anyone here tonight know what the closing date for that consultation is? It's just opened, hasn't it? So, Councillor Mrs Prendergast, you may be able to assist here.
It doesn't open till mid-January, and it's due to run for a couple of months. So
mid-January, so we would have plenty of time. Okay, we'll note that for the future work programme and look at that under agenda setting. Yeah. Any further comments? Councillor Mumford.
Just on that one, ward councillors, parishes will respond, but there are other impacts like Invicta School, I think Invicta Grammar for girls, they're talking about students arriving late, and so it will have an impact there as well. So there are more general ones than just an individual ward.
Okay, I think it's quite clear the committee would like to see a response. We'll see how we can go about doing that. I think that concludes looking at the work programme. Outside bodies, agenda item 12. I don't think I've got anything to report on that front. Looks like Councillor English is away anyway. So at that point, we'll move on to our first main piece of business this evening. This is agenda item 13. It's the review of the air quality management area and our low emissions strategy. And Mr. Haynes, you will introduce this item for us, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The purpose of the report is to approve the low emission strategy and the proposed revision to the air quality management area following the public consultation. The low emission strategy replaces and incorporates the current statutory air quality action plan with the increased scope for addressing wider emissions, demonstrating that the Maidstone Borough Council is committed to improving air quality. The changes to the air quality management area will enable us to focus resources on the areas of genuinely poor air quality. There are 32 individual actions in total in the action plan, divided into the themes of transport, planning, procurement, property and carbon management, and public health. The actions are numbered in each theme in the order of the greatest potential impact on air quality. The highest potential impacts in each theme are for transport, the implementation of a low emissions or clean air zone. For planning, the implementation of a local plan development document. For procurement, the review of our commissioning and procurement strategy. For property and carbon management, review of the park and ride scheme. And for public health, raising public awareness of air quality issues and promotion of good practices. There were a total of 57 individual responses to the public consultation. There were 4 organisational responses received, and 15 people attended 2 focus groups, which we ran over 2 evenings. The public consultation ran for 8 weeks and included direct contact with all councillors and parishes, as well as with statutory consultees and special interest groups. The consultation was also published on the council's social media outlets and promoted, and it was directly sent to all of those who are registered with the council's consultation portal and consultation team. We also did a public engagement day in Jubilee Square, where officers and councillors were available throughout the day to answer questions to the public and to promote the consultation. And that was followed by the 2 focus groups which were held for members of the public. Businesses that responded to the consultation were offered one-to-one meetings to discuss their views. The feedback was then collated and analysed, and the action plan was then revised, taking into account the feedback that was received. This was done at a council workshop where the responses were discussed by the Air Quality Working Group, and the action plan was revised accordingly. Progress on the action plan will be reported to the committee annually. So in conclusion, we hope that the strategy and the action plan are ready for your approval, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Can we just note for the record, Councillor de Wigan has joined us. May I just ask you quickly, any disclosures of lobbying or interest? None disclosed. Thank you. You're added to the minute book. Members, I see Councillor Mrs Springett would like to speak.
Just a couple of questions. One is more of a concern than a question, I think. On page 47, under Transport 6, it's regarding the emissions standard for taxis to Euro 6 standard. Now, funny enough, this actually came up at licensing last night, in the fact that we can only control the vehicles licensed in our area, so we have no control of vehicles coming into our area from outside. I know they are doing a review of that, but it does concern me because we can have very high requirements on our licensing, but the drivers will all go and license somewhere else and still come and work in our patch. So is there anything we can do? Is there anything in our policy we can do to try and limit older, poorer quality, more emissioning vehicles from coming into our patch? When they can register us, we can control the ones registered here, but not the ones that register in Tunbridge and Malling and then come and work in Maidstone. I just wonder, that's my first question. I've got one more thing, but I just wonder if there's anything we can do. I know in Germany now you have to buy a disc before you can go into the city that says your car meets a certain standards. Is there anything we can do on that point?
Probably as much a licensing issue as, but can either of the officers give any response?
I think certainly in terms of taxi licensing, we can only impose conditions on our own taxi licences. But in terms of looking at the wider fleet as a whole that uses Maidstone, that is something that could be an extension in the future to a low emission zone or a clean air zone. The plan at the moment would be to start with buses, move on to HGVs, and then sort of gradually extend that if it was feasible and necessary to include more vehicles.
Thank you. I think that's something that I would welcome, I think. And there was just one other point on the, I think it's in the same section, forgive me if I don't think I've jumped ahead on the agenda, page 64, which shows our AQMA and our NOx tube locations. I just wondered if there were any proposals to put any more in. Looking at the map and with reference to what the two ladies spoke on earlier, there don't seem to be too many on the Springfield Royal Engineers Way. There's one sort of fairly close into town, and then there's two expired ones up near the M20, and I just wondered whether there were any more proposals to perhaps put a new monitor in there, as it's really close to the actual AQMA bad area. And then the other one is actually out to the east on the Bearsted Road, just after Junction 7, where it turns east, which is a big queuing area every night. You've got one coming off the motorway where they don't queue, and then you've got nothing where they do. And I just wondered whether there were any proposals for any more NOx tubes, whatever they are, to be installed.
We do review the NOx tubes very regularly in terms of locations and numbers. We were recently quite complimented in our most recent annual screening report to DEFRA about the way that we proactively move the tubes around according to where we think we're, say for a tube for quite a period has shown no worrying levels. We then will move them around to places where we think that we might need to look at in a bit more detail, or additionally, if something comes up that we think we need to know a bit more about, we can commission a new tube. So we do review them quite regularly.
I'm going to use that as a point for me to come in with a matter I'd like to raise on the subject of monitoring. I think we're all very aware that there once was a monitoring station on the gyratory system. We've long awaited for it to be repositioned, and speaking with the officers, I understand some of the difficulties associated with making that happen due to actually finding a location, and it's a reasonably big piece of space that is needed, and there are associated costs with the permanent installation. I understand there are alternative options to us. Rather than having the fixed station, we could actually engage on a hire basis a fairly immediate solution to get some monitoring undertaken, because from what I understand, we haven't got a location to have the existing kit resited, and this has been going on for a number of years already. So what I'm putting out is whether we would support some short-term work to actually get some immediate air quality monitoring underway. So I put that out there as a question. Councillor English, seems like you might want to reply. And maybe where this leads us to is actually formally receiving a report giving us options.
I think we have to be very careful that we're looking at real options. I mean, it's very easy to get quite superficial information at a rather unscientific basis. So I think we need to be very, very careful about what it was we were actually agreeing to do. There are solutions out there, but not all of the potential solutions would actually give us verifiable measurements that would actually be of much use. So I think potentially, yes, but I'd need more detail about what you're saying.
So I think what I'm proposing is that we request a proposal being brought to this committee. There's going to be a cost implication, but if we're taking air quality seriously, and I believe that we should be, we need at least basic data to be able to, yes. And let's not preempt the detail that officers might be able to bring us, but I can assure you, having spoken to them, that the issue of appropriately approved monitoring techniques and DEFRA approval and all the rest of it is foremost in their minds. So shall we invite a piece of work? It would be nice if it could be for our next meet, well, perhaps one of the January meetings, but at the earliest opportunity, a proposal, because it may require us to look at what budget we have available or putting a case to P&R. But I just think that the situation with reciting that unit has gone on long enough. The officers could give us some detail of exactly where we're at on that, but I believe there may be solutions so that we can actually get on with the task. Councillor Willis.
To add to that, or just a cheaper way of doing that, possibly, is could we set a deadline for it to be sorted out, and then the report be done if that deadline's not met, which saves officers time? Because I think it's with legal, I understand, and it may give them a bit of a over to get it done.
I don't think we can set a deadline because the factors are outside of our control, which is why it has gone on for so long with no action. Let's park that there, invite a considered option for us to look at with the appropriate background and see whether the money is available to actually do it. Personally, I think this is a major issue. We should give it significant attention, but it's languishing a little bit through circumstances beyond our control. Beyond that, are there any other comments? Councillor Willis, do you want to speak on this item?
Yes, on the item, not
Yeah.
I've said my bit on what you
So
just said. Yes, please.
You
Yes,
have the
okay.
conch.
On page 48, I think this is the appropriate place to ask for an amendment, if possible. Obviously, there's a report. We're on. So we have, first of all, we have the strategy, yeah, and then we have the how to do the strategy document behind it. Is that right? So I am not jumping ahead agenda items here. So on page 48, it mentions about. Sorry, it's actually page 47. Work with schools to reduce impact of school. Work with schools to reduce the impact. Yeah. So I don't quite know where the fund. I wanted to ask the officers where funding for that would come from, if there's a stream that we can apply for, because we understand nationally that the biggest problem with pollution is pollution outside schools affecting younger children. I think that's one of the biggest problems, biggest health issues. And can I ask the officer a question? How do we get funding to do that? First of all, can I ask that and then come back, Chair?
At the moment, we don't have specific funding for a huge project with schools. Officers are sort of working up sort of various options to try and to get into schools. We're looking to contact the KM Walk on Wednesday scheme, because we sponsor them already, and the idea is, at the moment, in its early stage, is to sort of join in a bit more with that, and for officers to go into schools, talk to the kids, talk to the teachers, try and actively engage them in air quality, what it means. Say the scheme is, it's not entirely approved yet, but the two officers that are keen to work on it are quite keen to work on it, and so they're already sort of coming up with ideas and sort of working out how they might do it. But in terms of specific funding, this is one of the actions that we're looking to deliver from within existing resources at the moment.
Mr. Jarman, did you want to add?
Yeah, sorry, on a higher level. As Councillor Munford pointed out, I'm very well aware of children being late for school because buses increasingly are stuck in traffic jams, particularly on Hermitage Lane, actually. And that's obviously increasing pollution. As I've been saying for a number of years now, we can and have, in the case of Hermitage Lane, collected monies from house builders such as Crowdace to put in bus priority measures, bus loops, to get children into school and back home again a lot quicker.
Councillor Willis, back to you.
Yeah, to answer the Jarman's point, that is true, but more still needs to be done because Hermitage Lane, there isn't a full solution at the moment. It's a part solution. It's funded, but the planning isn't there. But that's going off the subject, really.
Sorry, I'm jumping on to the next item, but the inspector, Mr. Mellor, before writing his final report, made it very clear that it's not just the need to write the DPD, it's to start delivering on modal shift. And dare I say that the inspector at the inquiry at the DPD will be asking what our track record is of actually delivering the big stuff, as I would put it.
Good luck. No, I mean that in a positive way, not because I'll all day long I'll be trying to. Just going back to the officers, thank you for your answer. So on page 47, basically what I've done is, and I'm sorry I've got 2 of these, but I did have 5, but I've been through them with fellow councillors. There's things that I've asked for best practice from other areas that may not have been in our scheme, and a really simple thing that I'm asking what we maybe have to add into the wording. It mentions education and schools generally, but is in Hertfordshire, 3 Rivers, is it Hertfordshire?
Yeah, 3 Rivers.
Thames Valley. The schools, they basically had no idling. The council provided banners for schools that say no idling, as in if you're parked outside the school, turn your engine off, which reminds parents. It's really simple because it reminds parents not to leave their engine running outside schools. So there's a practical example which we're looking for in here of something that we can deliver. You look very happy about that. I'm asking if that can go into as an idea.
I don't think there's any reason we can't note that into the action column there. Yeah. I just generally members support that, just so that. Okay, right. We wrap that up at the end. Is that you finished, Councillor Willis?
I've got one more, and I'm hoping one of the other members might have another one. But there's it's a pretty simple one. But again, if I'm putting this in the wrong part of the report, but in page 31. Again, I've gone to the LJ and asked for other good practice, little things that we could add.
Was that
to
31, did you say?
Page 31, which is a lovely picture of a bus. Look, Councillor Burton, there's a bus. There you go. It's actually a low-emission bus. It's in Maidstone, blimey. We, obviously, there's a town centre group called One Maidstone, I'm aware of. I'm not an expert, but it mentions about us in the report, in this part of the report, and I haven't found the action, to be honest, but it mentions about working with the town to reduce emissions in the town centre, which is with organisations or the council. Can it specifically mention working with One Maidstone and the bid, which they're making, Business Investment District, because that may unleash more funding. That's happened in Ealing, sorry to give another practical example. But I don't know how to add it to the wording. That's a bit. I'm hoping for a bit of help if we do.
But it would get more funding. Clear about what you're proposing. What are you actually?
Right. Very simply, in the town centre, in Ealing, the Business Investment District manages to get extra rates from local businesses. I think that's how a Business Investment District works. Maidstone is that public? Business Improvement District. So it allows our town centre to claim more money. One Maidstone is that?
Would it be easier for the author of your notes to read them out, or do you want to carry on, Councillor?
These are from. I could ring him up. His name's Rob Banks, actually, the bloke that sent me this. If that'll help.
If I could help.
Right, go
on. Over to you, Councillor English. Could you put some clarity?
But what I think my colleague is talking about is the sort of thing which we have discussed in the working group about trying to reorientate deliveries from HGVs and things like that in the central business district to minimise the problems with manoeuvring in the vehicles and the consequent pollution risks. It's a very practical thing that can be done if the businesses and the council work together. That sort of thing.
I would have thought that that's broadly captured within our action plan already. But we discussed this quite extensively when we were drafting it.
In terms of looking at working with groups within the town centre and securing and helping and getting our hands on some funding, which I think is what you mean, that sort of thing could be a really useful addition to securing funding for working up a low emission zone, which would predominantly be in the town centre, and is a project that we are short of funds for. So if we could work with a group like that, it would be fabulous to try, they could help us get money to actually progress our actions. That would be a really practical thing.
But let's be very clear, do we need to add a word or two to what we have before us, or is it sufficiently covered in the round that that avenue can be explored?
If it name, sorry, I've jumped in. If it name checks and appropriately name checks an organisation, I don't know if that's okay, as in one Maidstone, then it also, if they know their names in this, I think you get cooperation. It certainly works with the Medway Valley Community Rail Partnership, where it's mentioned in our ITS. You seem to get more cooperation from them. So if it could mention, if one Maidstone are the council's approved body for town centre initiatives, then if it could mention them, and they're the ones that are doing the business investment district application.
If I would caution that we were talking about working with one Maidstone to bring forward that sort of proposal is a good idea, but we should be very careful about trying to direct the bid from outside, because that's one. The first is a good idea. The second could be a bit prescriptive, and they might not like it. So I would say something like working with one Maidstone and its potential successor organisation to bring forward that sort of initiative would be a very good idea, and we could put some word in about that. But I wouldn't go into too much detail about the bid, because that's for them and not for us.
Right, at the end of this, I want to be very specific about what we're actually putting into this if we're changing it, so we'll come back to some tight words for that. Is that you finished?
If you discuss this, I can't see it in the report, right? But I've read the whole agenda, of course, but I've read the main part of the report. So if I missed it in the actions, during my work with developers, and I think you may have discussed this previously, I've found that it seems to be that middle-class houses with garages that are not affordable, not necessarily the affordable sector houses, will have charging points. And I've certainly got a developer that was mentioned earlier to agree to do that, or they have agreed to do that. Housing associations, where they don't necessarily have parking, personal parking, individual parking spaces, where there's parking lots or shared parking, don't have parking, are less likely to have charging points at the moment, compared to affordable, less affordable, bigger houses. Everyone needs to take up the idea of having less pollutive cars, and one method is electric. Is there anything we can do, can I ask the officers, anything we could do within our strategy as a council, working with housing associations perhaps, to provide something appropriate, perhaps as communal parking, or parking that's safe and secure at parking spaces rather than garages? Because when I was talking to residents in Hermitage Lane at the new houses, one of them pointed out to me that he can't get his lead from his house. Okay, all right.
Can we keep this to one meeting?
Yeah,
so please continue.
Just to finish my point, I'm sorry if it is jumped ahead to the next item, but an action point is that a resident pointed out to me that you can get a plug-in charger that goes in a normal wall socket rather than a three-phase one, and he pointed out that he couldn't reach his parking space with it. So therefore, it's an example of where either design or whether it's, I think it is down to affordable quite often, because they're the ones that are built with less space and less garages. Is there anything we can do within this? And I think I've asked the group, the pollution strategy group, I think I put this in my consultation response, anything we can do to try and set up a building.
I think I'll pick up on this point. It's a suitable moment to retaliate to your comments about my ability to recognise a bus. If you're still under the misapprehension that things are actually low emissions, then, well, clearly not. And as somebody who's already moved to zero emissions, I strongly believe that that is ultimately the only solution we have to this problem on a proper scale. So what you're talking about is access to charging points. So if we can remind ourselves that last meeting, we already have adopted the technical planning guidance, which strongly puts a steer into how we address this issue. The DPD that we're going to come on to shortly gives us the opportunity to put more teeth to that. And the dichotomy of intention is that probably we do actually need to provide parking, which perhaps encourages the car, that is appropriately equipped and specified to charge the vehicles to achieve the zero emissions. But I think that's, if you read the action plan that's here, I think that's already well thought about. So if you're happy to leave that point as already covered, can we move on to you, Councillor English?
Can I just commend the report? I think it's excellent cross-party working as well, and it's been really good. In a year or 6-9 months, we've gone from something that was adopted or previously unadopted to something that's actually really good. And a comment from another council, I need to say this on record, another council that I was talking to about pollution actually said that Maidstone is ahead of the game, and I don't hear that from councils very often.
We are ahead of the game on a great many things. It doesn't always make us popular, but I do think we strive very hard to be doing the right things. Councillor English.
No, as you rightly cut me off and say, Mr. Chairman, because I was interrupting, the main point Councillor Willis was raising, the last point really does come up under the DPD, I think, rather than the actual action plan, because the action plan covers most of the relevant points there. I think it's not a perfect document, but considering where we came from, which was basically we hadn't got very much of anything other than an area on a map, and no policies really or actions to support it, which looked pretty good on a map, but that's all it was. It's been quite successful. We had to struggle across party, those of us who wanted this work to be done, but it has now been done. Not everyone is happy. There have been criticisms about the new spatial map, for example, the air quality area. But I think that fundamentally the test will be in whether the new map and the more tightly drawn boundaries allow us to take decisive actions. Because it's no use if it doesn't, if it just becomes an excuse for, having a tidy little set of aspirations. And this council has had quite a few policy documents over the years that never went anywhere and achieved very much at all. But so far, the signs are good, and I hope that we will continue to make progress. Officers have already been making a number of grant applications and delivering some work. There's lots still to do, but I think it's a good start, and I hope that we adopt it and we move on fairly quickly to the quite hard part, which is doing the development plan document.
Enough said. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back just very briefly to the problem at schools, I think going in and talking to the schools and getting the children to sort of be, oh, don't forget to switch your engine off, Dad, when you're waiting for me, whatever. But also, I think we have got to go back and hammer home to the buses that they need to switch their engines off. I have had to ring on more than one occasion to the new venture buses outside. Other types of bus are available. But when they're sitting outside there, they have to be reminded. And the other place that I see them sitting with their engines on is actually on the entrance to the bus station below our ramp coming up to us in the borough. And I think they need to be reminded and keep on top of that.
Ask that we try and keep this up to a slightly more strategic approach rather than specific parking of buses, please.
And lastly, I would like to move that we adopt, as on the papers, with items 1, 2 and 3 that are in front of us.
Did you mean to say with the amendments that we have discussed? So let's be very specific about that. This was the addition of the mention of the banner campaign for schools. yeah, and cooperate with One Maidstone to explore opportunities through their business improvement district bid to promote clean air. Is that... Okay. Cooperate with One Maidstone to explore opportunities such as their business improvement district bid to promote clean air. Yeah? Happy that that's exactly what we mean? Right. So with those two amendments that I trust you will happily accept, I'm pleased to second that, and can we move to the vote? Although, having said that, Councillor Mrs Prendergast, I see that you have indicated before you should speak.
Thank you, Chairman. I also want to thank officers and members in the cross-party working group for having come this far. This is a huge achievement. But I just have one question to ask. Page 60, regarding the development plan and the timescale. 3 to 5 years, I'll have to put my glasses on. 50, not 60. 3 to 5 years just seems like a very, very long time. We've had a huge amount of building over the last few years. More to come.
Can I ask for clarification of your page reference there?
It says page 50 at the bottom.
50, yes.
I'm just a little concerned about how this... I mean, I know we're talking about modal shift at 7%, and I know people have differing opinions on that, but to me it's still aspirational, and with the amount of cars that we're putting on the road, I don't think it'll be a drop in the ocean. So this 3 to 5 years really worries me, and I promised Dr. Maxwell earlier that I wouldn't mention European Directive 2008/50, which requires us to bring air pollution down at the fastest possible pace. And when I hear things like not perfect, it does worry me. Are we confident we are doing everything we can to make this happen as quickly as we possibly can? Because we are talking about public health here.
Mr Edison.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Prendergast. Absolutely. I think the first thing I would like to say is that we don't anticipate this taking 3 to 5 years. Although there's been an amendment in the column after that, which indicates an estimated delivery time of 2 years, that has not been amended in that column, and you rightly say it still currently says 3 to 5 years. That is not correct. We're looking at a 2-year, and hopefully that will be a maximum.
Councillor Cox, with your approval, will add that amendment to the motion. Councillor Willis.
Can you just clarify what the amendment is? What period the amendment is?
2 years has just been suggested, so it's a small point. I fully take on board what you say about EU directives and the like. I still think this comes down to a real fundamental. Until we ditch internal combustion engines on the road, that's the big one. And maybe even start to consider ditching fossil fuel boilers at home. You know, that's a significant contributor. Things that we'll pick up through the DPD, but if we want real change, we've got to do something different, and I think the difference comes at that level. I think we've had enough on this. Shall we move to the vote? The motion, as per the papers, with the 3 amendments, as is clearly specified. Those in favour, please. Those against? No abstentions. Noted, 1 member absent. Thank you, members, and thank you, officers, for your work. Can we move straight into that which we've already alluded to? This is consideration of the Air Quality Development Plan document. Mrs Lee, would you start us off, please?
Thank you, Chairman. This is the first report about the Air Quality Development Plan document, or for shorthand, Air Quality Local Plan, and it follows on neatly from the earlier report about the low emission strategy. Planning can play a significant role in contributing to the objectives of the low emission strategy by delivering growth in a sustainable manner and by securing mitigation measures in conjunction with development. And that includes encouraging the use of sustainable transport modes, as well as the adoption of new technologies such as electric vehicle charging points, which will reduce emissions. Mr Jarman's already mentioned that air quality matters were gone into in quite considerable depth by the local plan inspector when he considered our local plan. He considered there was a need for more robust mitigation measures centred on modal shift for the purposes of both the transport strategy and also for improving air quality. And there's a really clear overlap here in such that measures such as travel planning, walking and cycling infrastructure, electric vehicle infrastructure and public transport improvements all serve to support both transport and air quality objectives. The adopted plan includes a specific air quality policy already, and that sets out a sequential approach for assessing and addressing the air quality impacts of new development. And just to be absolutely clear, that policy will continue to have full weight while we're progressing this new local plan policy. But again, returning to the local plan inspector, he noted that there was a changing local and national context in terms of the new national air quality plan and also our own emerging low emission strategy. And so he signalled to us there was a need for more urgent work, that it wasn't a matter that could wait for the local plan review. And indeed, the local plan sort of contains a commitment that we do undertake this subject-specific local plan. There's two principal purposes, I think, for this report that's in front of you this evening. Firstly, we're seeking the committee's formal agreement to progress work on the air quality local plan. I think up from your work programme, it's not until March that you'll actually be considering the local development scheme, which is the sort of the formal timetable for the different local plan documents we'll be producing. And really this report is coming in advance of that and asking for your authority to progress work now. And then secondly, it's to outline the potential scope of what the local plan could cover for officers to go away and further investigate over the coming months. Those points are set out in the body of the report, but just in overview, that could include, firstly, establishing a method for measuring air quality impacts resulting from development, and that could include looking at cumulative impacts where you have a number of developments in a given location. Secondly, establishing a method for quantifying the scale of mitigation that's needed associated with new development. Thirdly, looking at the types of mitigation measures, including perhaps more detailed specifications for things like EV charging points, and I think that sort of starts to relate to the points that Councillor Willis was talking about the location and number of charging points in a housing development. It could focus on actually securing mitigation as part of development, but also, if that is not possible for justifiable reasons, perhaps setting out arrangements for how we would obtain and spend financial contributions for measures off-site. And then a fifth strand is looking at perhaps more specific design guidance for developments in terms of perhaps the landscape siting of landscaping within schemes to give separation between roads and where people are living, thinking about sort of the external appearance in terms of perhaps where there's locations of balconies and such like, and having those away from busy roads. And then maybe even looking at internal room arrangement, so habitable rooms are again away from the generators of poor air quality. So that the second recommendation on your papers does relate to that potential scope of the local plan, and asking for that to be agreed, subject to any changes you want to make at this stage. Just on a point of detail, I've noticed that the paragraph references in recommendation 2, they've actually slipped a bit. So they refer to paragraphs 1.6 to 1.11, and actually that should be 1.7 to 1.12. The report also goes into the facts, and you'll be very well aware of this, having gone through the local plan process, that this is, because this is a local plan, there are statutory processes of consultation and preparation and indeed examination that we'll need to go through. It'll be subject to the tests of soundness, which I know you're fully versed on, and also legal tests, including duty to cooperate with our neighbours. Subject to committee's consideration, officers will work on the evidence gathering and research stages, leading to a first stage of consultation. And as Mr. Edgerton's already indicated, we anticipate sort of the whole process taking 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. So members, it's quite clear what we're being asked here. First is to give the go-ahead for this work, which should produce a powerful and meaningful document to actually force through the measures that we need with regard to air quality. And secondly, if there's anything further in the scoping that you want to highlight that's not already contained. So, Councillor English, I think you're first, and then we'll work anti-clockwise.
I've just found the flag up, an issue that I know Councillor Harwood has raised elsewhere. We're quite rightly focused on transportation development, mostly housing and economic development, but we shouldn't forget that some agricultural and forestry processes can have quite a significant air impact. Yes, they do. Don't smile. And it can be quite significant. And we should not ignore those factors when we prepare the document, because large-scale agribusiness can have a significant impact. Of course, it's not limited to air quality, but in this particular aspect, we're looking at this area. So I just want to make sure that we're actually picking up that part of development in the DPD.
Firstly, may I say smiling should be encouraged. This isn't a sad process. But secondly, we're picking up the point about agricultural impact. Mrs. Lee, is that something we need to add to the scoping to make sure it is specifically captured, or is there anything in there already? It's the scope. Do you want to look at that while we move on to Councillor Willis, and then we're moving around?
Perhaps the scientists over there, the wording of that needs, if that's suggested, but could we just understand about, because basically Councillor Harwood at Planning Committee quite often, but also in a response to the consultation, he's banged on about fertiliser being a bad pollutant. Can we ask our officers training this, roughly what does he mean? Is it something you're familiar with as a pollutant?
Let's not get into the scientific debate of the individual things. We're just trying to lay out the scoping. So if we mention that when it comes to scoping, we'll see what the possibilities are. So let's reserve the technical scientific.
Fine. But if we vote on it, it'd be useful to understand what we're voting on. Or if we recommend it to change in the report, which sounds a very good idea, it'd be useful to understand the science of it, because I'm a bit thick and I don't.
Yeah,
of that.
That comes later, though. All we're just doing is saying, go ahead with the work, and this is the scope of the topics to consider. So agricultural, horticultural impacts, we'll make sure that that's covered. And the detail will follow later. Anything further to add, Councillor Willis?
The point we made earlier, and perhaps you might help me with this if you want to, is, the Chair may help me with this, is page 81D of the scoping. It says this could include infrastructure such as EV charging points, which is electric voltage charging points. Is that right, Chair? I think that's
electric vehicle charging
as
points,
part of
yes.
a travel plan. Now, I know there's a travel plan in one of the applications along Hermitage Lane, and that led to the middle class houses having charging points because it is economic for them, but not the point I made earlier, not the affordable. Could we add in there something like, and perhaps this is probably, you guys might tame this down a bit, but this could include physical infrastructure such as EV charging points, accessible for all residents, or something, perhaps a more carefully worded way of that? So we actually know we're looking at trying to find solutions for everyone, not just what the because it's going to be paid for by the developer.
So I think that the phrase that you've actually captured quite well there is accessibility to charging infrastructure. So if those words are not specific there, but accessibility, kind of linked to that, and I don't think the words in front of us do create this restriction. What I would urge us to is to think about tomorrow's technology and not just today's. So, I give you a very simple example of that. We've already got it very clearly in our mind that what we have to aspire to is somewhere to plug our car in, or our electric scooter, or our electric bus, whatever it is. But already technology is past that. The mobile phone doesn't plug in anymore, it just sits on an inductive charging pad. So think about tomorrow's technology, not just what we think it is today, and it will be moving extremely fast in the next few years. So, Mrs. Lee.
Because this is a local plan, it will need to be based on evidence, and so we will need to have some reasonable expectation that perhaps the technology we're anticipating is going to come forward. I've certainly been doing some background reading, and it does relate to EV charging points, but it's sort of possible to, if you like, put the wiring in underground as the development happens, and then subsequently you can retrofit, the charging technology to it. So absolutely understand, completely take on board the point about future-proofing, but just with the realism caveat.
Anything further, Councillor Wiss?
No, I support.
Noted. Councillor Mumford.
Just very quickly, I've heard you talk about heating systems, etc., because I don't see the word renewable within sort of design principles, etc. Should we not be considering renewables? And where you was getting stuck on the agricultural bit, I think you should be using the word agricultural practices. That's what you will end up looking at.
That's very helpful. Councillor English. Sorry, one meeting. So agricultural practices, good phrase. And renewables, we want to make sure that that's in the scope. Councillor English, I'll come to you.
When talking about heating, there are types of renewable resources that are actually quite bad for air quality. If you burn a lot of wood of certain types, it's quite renewable, but it actually isn't particularly brilliant for air quality. So I think you've got to be a little bit careful when air quality DPD, when we're talking about renewable. You've got to be a bit. I think we need to be a bit more narrow than that, because some types are not appropriate.
Point taken, but I think the consideration of renewables, this is the scoping, so we would need to include consideration and possibly rule out some of those as you're suggesting. Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Councillor de Wiggenen.
Very briefly, just to come back to the point about having charging sites, I think it's important, when we're talking about accessibility, and for affordable houses to actually have sufficient sites, because it's all very well to say that actually when we have these parking spots, we can plan for them to have charging, but actually with lots of these sites, as we know, they're away from the house actually because there aren't sufficient spots for all the homes, and I suspect we have an issue where the demand for each of those spots is quite high already, and when they're actually the only spot with a charging place as well, that's going to become even worse. So going forward, where we have a situation where certainly where we have affordable homes, they haven't had sufficient spaces. Like you said, it might be counterintuitive, but actually the modal shift we're going to get that's going to improve our air quality is not going to be car to bus. It's going to be petrol to electric, and we need to make sure there's not just that. We need to have the spaces to do all of this.
I think your point is well made, and we began to capture that early. And at the risk of sounding a madman on the topic, actually, this is where technology comes in again, because this fixation with the parking space by our home goes away. The vehicle will drive itself to wherever the charging infrastructure is and return when you need it. At the risk of sounding the madman, but that is tomorrow's technology. And I'm thinking possibly Thursday or Friday of this week, not 100 years' time.
You're planning to build one in Marden, aren't you? That's what.
Well, there are cars that do it already. We don't have the legislation that allows them to do it, but they're on the road now. Councillor Mrs Prendergast.
Thank you. Mrs Lee, when you first started speaking, I had moments of déjà vu, because I'm sure I was using some of the same words last week in the same chamber, but then I realised it was your voice and not mine, but it was quite interesting. It's just a real quick one. It was only when you were talking about the cumulative impacts, etc., you know, taking those into consideration. And you quite rightly pointed out that the Inspector, Mr Mellor, in July, in his final report, spoke about the changing context, and it's changed massively since then again, hasn't it? Because we've had the Client Earth ruling, we've had other High Court cases. And I was just looking at page 81, where you talk about quantifying the mitigation required and converting the damage into a monetary value. I'm not suggesting for a second that there's anything wrong with that. You know, I don't know enough about it, but it's something that's going to take a lot of consideration and hard work, especially given the recent Swale ruling, which I know I've discussed in this chamber as well, where the judge was absolutely clear that you just can't convert the harm into money and throw that at it. You have to actually provide the certainty that whatever you're throwing at it will work. So I think it's going to be interesting going forward. I wish I was part of it. Thank you.
To assist matters, I'll move the recommendations per the papers from the Chair with the amendment such that it reads paragraphs 1.7 to 1.12, progress the preparation of the plan, and if we could add, but also to include consideration of agricultural practices, emerging technology and renewable energy options. So I think they're the three things that members have added. Councillor English has seconded. Councillor Willis, did you want to?
At the beginning, I think we agreed to add accessibility before EV charging points.
Right, with the further addition of...
No mention of buses, just EV charging points.
Accessibility to charging infrastructure. And agricultural and horticultural practices. Okay. Captured that. Right, so that's moved from the Chair. Councillor English has seconded that. May I ask those in favour to show? That's unanimous and therefore carried. Thank you, members. Can we move to agenda item 15? That is fees and charges 2018-19. Ms Deli.
Thank you. So this report sets out the proposed fees and charges for this committee covering the period up to the end of March 2019. A detailed list of all the charges has been provided at Appendix 1 to the report, and the committee is asked to agree the proposed charges for the area where the council has discretion to determine them, and also to note the charges which aren't determined by the council but are included in this report for information. Budgeted and actual income forecasts are also included in the report for context, but they don't form part of the recommendation. Fees and charges obviously form a significant proportion of the council's income, and it's good practice to review them on a regular basis to ensure they remain appropriate. This usually forms part of the medium-term financial planning process, although it doesn't have to. They can be reviewed outside of this process. So budget managers have reviewed all the fees and charges in their respective areas in line with the council's charging policy. This year, in the majority of cases, it's been determined by the budget manager that the existing fees are appropriate. However, there are some changes proposed to local land charges. The fees in this area have remained static since the introduction of the new shared service in 2013-14. And the proposed changes will align the fees for Maidstone with our partners across the shared service. And this is expected to enable more efficient administration in this area. On that one, it's also recommended that the change implemented immediately, so starting from tomorrow, if agreed. There haven't been any changes proposed to parking charges. However, the budget manager has proposed that the income budget might be increased for the forthcoming year based on overperformance against the budgeted figures observed over the past year. And that is reflected in the table in the report. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your introduction. Members, any questions, comments? I think this is pretty straightforward as set out before us. Doesn't directly relate to this, but I would like to make the request that when financial monitoring information comes in front of us, I'm looking as an example at the table on page 88. When we look at the spectrum of what this committee covers, we've got a pot of income which is extremely healthy and a service that has a significant cost. And we always look at it on the same page, and you always look at the figure at the bottom of the page, and that's fine, isn't it? But actually you've got two very, very different stories running. And I would like to make the request to finance officers or whoever's involved in preparing reports that they're served to us on two different plates and we look at them quite separately. Does that make sense, what I'm suggesting there? So perhaps that could be noted and taken on board. But other than that, I think it's very straightforward. Shall I move the recommendations as per the papers from the Chair? Councillor Cox, thank you for your seconder. Those in favour? Unanimous and therefore carried. Thank you very much, members. Moving swiftly along. Item 16, Green and Blue Infrastructure Action Plan. Mrs Arnold, can I ask you to open the debate for us?
Thank you, Chairman. Maidstone Borough Council adopted its Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy in June 2016, and the strategy formed an integral part of the evidence base of the Maidstone Borough Local Plan. To facilitate the delivery of the local plan commitments along with the GBIS, an accompanying action plan is being brought to this committee for adoption. During the preparation of both the Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy and the action plan, the Council engaged with a large number of stakeholder and interest groups through focused workshops that aim to understand key concerns and suggestions for ways to conserve and enhance green and blue infrastructure in the borough. The action plan recognises that as the planning, design and management of the green and blue infrastructure resource is the responsibility of many different organisations, the strategy and action plan can only be delivered successfully in partnership. Key stakeholders to the GBIS and the draft action plan were Maidstone Borough Council councillors, KCC councillors, parish councillors, resident associations, resident groups, Maidstone Borough Council officers, Environment Agency, Kent Downs AOMB units, including the Medway Valley Countryside Partnership and Mid-Kent Downs Partnership, Kent Wildlife Trust, River Catchment Improvement Groups, neighbourhood authorities and Friends of Parks and Allotment Association representatives. This action plan seeks to capture the thinking and ideas from the workshops and present them as deliverable projects within key themes identified in the adopted strategy. Each project has an identified delivery lead. However, sources of funding are not identified for each specific project, but could encompass such things as external grant funding applications, developer contributions, community infrastructure levy receipts, or other local funding initiatives. The projects identified in the action plan will take various different lengths of time to deliver, and some are already underway, whereas others may be dependent on other external factors. The committee is asked to adopt the Maidstone Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy Action Plan to accompany the already adopted Maidstone Green and Blue Infrastructure Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. I think I have Councillor English and then Councillor Mrs Prendergast. I thought that might be the case. Councillor English.
Rather facetiously, perhaps I would say it probably should be green and brown infrastructure, given the colour of most of our watercourses in Maidstone. But nevertheless, it's encouraging. When earlier editions of this work were, shall we say, not particularly environmentally sensitive, were rather empty of content. It's encouraging how far this has come since the rather depressing early experiences of trying to develop an action plan, which was, shall we say, not much plan and certainly no action. This is very different. Congratulations to the officers who worked on it and the various members who've put in input over the years. I was going to raise a point and then I realised it was already in here. So I have nothing further to add except my congratulations, and I'd like to formally move the recommendation.
Well said, Councillor. That being the case, I'm very happy to second, as per the papers. Councillor Willis, you wish to speak?
Again, this might be me being silly, but before I become a councillor, I seem to remember there was a kind of public councillors and interested parties training exercise on the green and blue infrastructure, green and blue infrastructure plan. I may have missed it, but what I'd really like to know as a member is how we can use this, and not now, not tonight, my question is a lead into a question, how we can use this to affect planning applications and proactive spending of Section 106 money, etc., in our wards. Is there going to be, and if I've missed it recently, then this is a silly Willis, isn't it? But is there going to be any training for members and parishes, etc., interested parties, on how we can use this to guide us on appropriate spending of Section 106, etc.?
Mr Edgerton.
I think what I'd say with regard to this item is that it's specifically looking at a green and blue infrastructure strategy action plan. Rather than the strategy itself. And the action plan has, as we've noted tonight, several specific points focused around delivery. And now, Ms Arnold has made the point that the majority of agencies tasked with delivery are external to the authority. I can say that, in fact, we had a conversation with one of the key individuals and one of the key organisations only this week to help facilitate delivery of the action plan. So there will be actions which we will be able to undertake as an authority, but I have to say that the majority of actions will be for external bodies, specialist bodies, environmental bodies to implement as well. So I just wanted to provide a caveat to the committee in that regard, rather than any belief that it was actually down fully to this council to do all the implementation. Thank you.
Maybe, perhaps it's not the council's responsibility then, but personally, I'm talking selfishly here, I would like a refresher, some kind of session on how we can use the blue and green infrastructure strategy appropriately. Is there anything we could arrange to do that? And for parishes and for perhaps even members of the public, I don't know how that would.
Well, I was going to say, would that fit within the planning training syllabus? So I guess officers present would note that. Mr. Jarman?
Yeah, I think it would be better, personally, not just to hang it on the green and blue infrastructure action plan, but about a refresher on the 3 statutory tests for Section 106 agreements.
Okay, I think that suggestion is taken on board. The motion is moved. It has been seconded. Can I take that to the vote? Those in favour? Again, unanimous and therefore carried. Thank you, members. We're doing very well here. It's leaving us with agenda item 17, which is the Authority Monitoring Report. Mr. Watson, can you assist us?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, councillors. Local plan guidance states that the local plan authorities must publish information at least annually that shows progress with local plan preparation, reporting any activity relating to the duty to cooperate and showing how the implementation of policies in the local plan are progressing. This year's Authority Monitoring Report, AMR, has evolved from the previous year. The basic structure has remained the same, though, with the 2 main sections focusing on the profile of Maidstone and the performance of the local plan. However, during the local plan examination, the Council presented and agreed with the local plan inspector significant revisions to the local plan performance indicators. And this change has resulted in the number of local plan indicators being reported in the AMR increasing from 12 to 50, which is quite a significant increase. Further on top of that, there was a number of other indicators that were recommended within the local plan sustainability appraisal, which total about a further 20, and they've been incorporated into the profile of section of the AMR. Some of these additions have overlapped with existing profile and local plan indicators, but in a number of cases, additional indicators have been required and added in appropriately. The local plan and sustainability appraisal indicators, some of them are quite new, so we haven't been able to get all the information yet as they weren't previously monitored. So the AMR has not been able to report certain details or trends at this stage, but it's hopeful that in future years, as these new indicators are monitored, that the trends will be able to be identified. Where possible, data from the years 2011 to 2017 has been used within the AMR to monitor changes to the borough and to reflect on progress of the local plan. Even though the AMR reports on the monitoring year 1st of April 2016 to the 31st of March 2017, it also acknowledges the adoption of the local plan in October of this year to help provide clarity on the status of the plan and the monitoring of its policies. The AMR draws on extensive data from a wide range of sources, including the 2011 census and updates, sources from the Department of Communities and Local Government and Historic England, to name but a few. In summary, the key highlights of the AMR include Maidstone's population continues to grow and in 2016 was over 166,000. Of the residential population, professional occupation workers at 19% are now the largest employment group, and over 44% of Maidstone residents over the age of 16 years are educated to a degree level or above. Between 2011 and 2015, Maidstone saw a sharp decrease in the level of CO2 emissions per capita, and there was also a significant increase in the number of energy performance certificates on new dwelling. The Council's 5-year housing land supply continues to improve, and at the 1st of April 2017 demonstrates a surplus of over 1,400 dwellings, which represents 6.3 years' worth of housing land supply. The percentage of those claiming job seekers allowance in Maidstone has increased during the monitoring period by 0.5%. However, during the years 2011-2015, an additional 6,000 jobs have been created within the borough. And finally, the Council has secured an additional 2.4 hectares of open space during the monitoring year through planning permissions granted on sites allocated within the local plan. To conclude, from the indicators presented within the latest AMR, a picture is beginning to develop that shows the Council is making good progress towards the targets that are set out within the local plan 2017. Councillors are being asked to note the contents of the AMR.
Thank you. May I just remind us that the purpose of receiving this item is in actual fact to note that it is indeed published and to consider it as our background knowledge that should be used to influence our decision making through the year. So it's not time for a forensic examination of every chart and every graph. However, if there are any accuracies or points of clarification that we may need to seek, now is the moment to do it. But really, it's just for noting. Members, is that noted? Thank you. That indeed does conclude our business this evening. That was a fairly significant agenda, so thank you for your concise and accurate contribution.